Hey guys, welcome to my Warden guide for update 18, and we are specifically going to focus today on class traits. This guide is for people learning about the class, but more specifically, how to reach your maximum potential as an endgame Warden. This is my main build, and I use this for pretty much any type of content in the game: soloing, questing, grouping, raiding, any main DPS role is what I use this for. After picking Recklessness, you'll see that you get all these set bonuses down here. Some of them are pretty straightforward. They just give you extra damage. This is very useful, and a lot of people don't know about it, is that your main three builders, Quick Thrust, Shield Bash, and Warden's Taunt, give you small bonuses. So, for example, Quick Thrust gives you 5% extra light dot damage with a 25% chance to apply. So normally this would be 10%, but because of this set bonus, you get an extra 15% chance to apply that. And that's really nice for DPS to get a couple of those going. That's a lot of extra damage. The shield one isn't all that great for DPS. It increases your morale taps by 2%. Your Warden's Taunt increases critical damage dealt by fist gambits by 5%. So that's also very huge for DPS. This allows you to get some heals from pairing, which is why avoidance and stacking agility is very important. I want to tell you about Grandmaster weapons training because I see a lot of wardens using something other than a sword. Now, if you're a man race, you really want to think about using a sword just because of this trait, and B, just because of the man inherent sword damage, and allows you to get additional parry percentage. So going into the traits and why I specifically chose them, you'll see that I have a majority of my trait points in red line and then some in blue line. And the reason for this is there's a lot of traits in red line that don't actually give you a substantial DPS increase. And going into blue line, you do get some extra benefits. Starting off, basic strikes, your gambit builders are more powerful. Gambit builders are considered these three basic skills. They're your spear, shield, and fist. Because you're going to be using these quite frequently, putting extra 5 points in here is well worth it. Specifically because of Warden's Taunt. Vital points increase your potency of bleeds. Now it's important to note here that bleed damage and dot damage in this game are two separate things. So bleed damage is for all of your spear line skills. For right now, in this update, provides considerable damage, but not as much as the light dot damage. But it's still worth the trait because I still use it in my rotation. Next, I put 5 points in physical mastery just because this increases the damage of all your abilities. So having extra mastery at the end of the day is always good. As you can see here, I have 100k physical mastery. Next we have more spear, gambit damage. Light damage skills are your spear virtue line and your fist line skills. They apply a light damage dot, and so having this is pretty much a must-have for DPS. Same thing with here, you're giving yourself an additional 10% chance to crit on those abilities. Deep wounds, now you're giving yourself more critical damage for those crits. So these two synergize very well. And then lastly, you're also getting an additional pulse, and your spear bleeds do burst damage when they expire. These three are very centric to the Warden DPS. And finally, you get your Recklessness ability, which gives you that 20 seconds of plus 50% melee damage, which is huge, with only a minute and 30-second cooldown. Timing and using that skill effectively is very important. There's a bunch of skills I don't get. So the reason why I don't pick this is because the AoE damage from this is very weak. It's not all that great, and doing Wall of Steel, although it does, 3 relatively high damaging attacks, it actually does less than Spear Virtue, which is the same number of gambits, and also applies a 30-second dot. So there's almost no reason to use that gambit unless you want to interrupt inductions, and to spend points for it to do AoE damage would be okay in AoE situations, but it's not worth the points because of the damage output. And so these next three really synergize with how this mechanic works. They'd have to buff the damage on it, in my opinion, for it to really be viable. On the offense, increases morale taps and morale damage. Unless you're soloing, you're really not going to be using your morale taps, at least for DPS. This trait applies an incoming heal debuff, so this is very specific to specific fights. And going further, Warden's Triumph, so this is one I've kind of gone back and forth. It gives additional bonuses to Adroit Maneuver and Warden's Triumph. And the reason I'm not trading this is because I found that the added benefit from using these two skills is nice, but the fact that you have to use them takes away from the ability to use other skills, and comboing the fact that I can use these points elsewhere. The last one that I don't use is Shield Spikes, gives 20% crit damage, which sounds really nice, but it's for shield skills. So in DPS, you're not going to use whatever the gambit starts with. So for example, Restoration is a shield skill because it starts with a shield. But for example, Spear of Virtue is a fist skill because it starts with a fist, and Power Attack is a spear skill because it starts with a spear. So although 20% crit damage is nice, it's not worth putting the point in to it, and because there's not a lot of shield-based attacks are used for damage output. Most of your damage output comes from your fist line and then followed by your spear line. So that's the recklessness tree, why I trait those skills. So the determination line, the main reason why I go down this, well, there's a couple of reasons. But one of the main reasons is you can actually get an additional 20% more light damage from Bane of Shadow, which is really, really nice to have. So in order to get to that point, you have to put some points in here, which gives you some extra healing in your Preserve Gambit line. So you have Preserve, which is your 2 Gambit builder, Safeguard, which is your 3 Gambit builder, and the 4 Gambit builder is Celebration of Skill. This is the only one in the line that doesn't give you a hot, but it gives you some other stats there. And then the last one is your Restoration ability. So grabbing this instead of this is vastly worth it, because here you only get, if you put all 5 points in there, 680 evade from Warcry, which is one skill, and have high enough traits. You can see that you should have pretty much capped out evade. So getting some extra evade here isn't really all that worth it. Getting 15% extra healing is very worth it. So I put 4 points here because that's all you need in order to go past this tree here. So this just gives you more block rating for using that preserved line, which is very nice because Wardens inherently have issues getting block because block comes from might, and we just don't stack might anymore. We're primarily an agility class. So you can see right here I have really low block compared to my parry and evade. And that's why getting something like this and using those skills increases your avoidance, and why I would go with this trait here. So the next 2 traits here are Defiant Challenge and then the Defiance, which gives you more mitigation for Defiant Challenge. So Defiant Challenge is your Force Taunt. It's a 10 target Force Taunt, and the reason why you want this even in DPS line is because if you have a ton of stuff attacking you, using the Defiance trait, you get an additional 8% mitigation for both physical and tactical for each target affected. So you can see if I hit 10 targets with the skill, I get 80% more mitigation on top of the 50% I already have. So you're pretty much invulnerable for that duration. Defiant Challenge has a 20-second cooldown, has a 12-second duration. So you can see here, because I hit these 4 training dummies, I got 4 8% mitigation stacks, which is really nice. So for 12 seconds out of every 20 seconds, you can gain that extra mitigation. So this is really good for soloing content. You can kite around, come back to your mobs, hit them with this skill, gain some extra mitigation, and keep going. The other reason why this is very effective, so even though if you're DPSing, This force taunt copies the tank's threat, and because you're not in a tank line, it doesn't give you the multiplier above them. So what it does is it just puts you at the tank's threat for a while. You can't be damaged, pretty much, if you're tanking a bunch of stuff. And as soon as that force taunt wears off, it will pretty much go right back to the tank because they're able to generate way more threat than you can. And the reason why you want to use this to your advantage in DPS is because of this trait right here called counterattack. So your mastery skills, which are your double gambit builders, so you can see I have them here in my first shift row, shift 1, 2, 3, 4, and num 1 through 5. So those give you your 2 gambits, and that's really the core of the rotation, is maximizing those. But so what this trait does is on a evade or partial evade, your mastery cooldowns will be reset. Using all of your masteries, getting them on cooldown, using your Defiant Challenge to taunt, have mobs hit you, proc this partial evade or evade, and it will reset all your masteries, allowing you to get more gambits off in the same time frame. So this is actually very important to maximizing damage. Obviously you can only use it in certain situations, but just in general, even if you don't taunt and you're attacking something, using or understanding how this mechanic works is very, very handy. So every 15 seconds you can get this reset. So that's another reason why I go down the blue line, is for that benefit as well. And finally, we just get some more additional healing on restoration. Restoration, like I said, is your main source of healing, especially if there's only one mob. Life tap abilities scale with the number of targets that are around you. And then finally, an additional 3 hot pulses to kind of just round out the build to give you more survivability, more damage, in terms of getting the light damage here, getting some synergy with being able to reset some of your skills. You get extra healing, you get extra defense. The reason why I don't put points in Assailant for my main line is just because of the synergy of these 2 lines working together. Assailant right now, in terms of damage outputs, very, very weak. There are some traits that are worthwhile, but for the most part, this should be your main build. Obviously, this focuses on having 82 trait points. If you don't have those trait points, I really recommend working towards that, and that's something that allows you to get this build completed and really maximizes your outputs from trait trees. So I'll just go into a couple of my other builds real quick. So this is one of the builds I've been using for debuffing, and I'll probably go into that later in a later video, but what this allows you to do is to get the diminished target debuff and the marked target debuff abilities, and give them some extra percentages, and that's really important in some fights, especially in raid content. This is another build that I've been trying to fool with a little bit. You lose some survivability, but I've been trying to see if that Warden Triumph was really worth it. And the other reason to use this build would be for increased attack speed. So for fights where you need to remove a lot of corruption, Never Surrender build. So we have a blue trait line down here called Never Surrender, which reduces the cooldown of Never Surrender by 300 seconds. So I only use this build to press this button and then switch to another build. So you can see that if I'm in my DPS build, Never Surrender is a 10-minute cooldown. So if I'm out of combat, before a fight, I switch to this build. It now has a 5-minute cooldown. I can pop it. I can switch back to my main build, and it still has that 5-minute cooldown. So that just allows you to not have to wait so long in between fights to get that to proc, and it's very useful. A very useful trait to have, but not one that you necessarily need while you're fighting. And my last build is my tank build, or tank and solo build. And so this is very similar to the other build, except for I am now in determination, or blue line, so I have blue line traits, but I have pretty much the same blue traits here, except for I added this one just to get some extra miss chance on Desolation. But for the most part, I have the same blue traits as before. Because red traits now cost 2 points for every point instead of 1 because I'm in blue line, I can't get as many of the red traits. So things that I skip out on are the bleed damage, because you're not going to be doing many spear attacks or spear bleed based attacks while you're in this kind of solo mode, because you're pretty much fending for your life. You're trying to survive but do as much damage as you can, so you still get your builders, your extra mastery, light damage, and your 3 core traits right here. And I did go with some extra morale tap damage, because in this survivability line you're going to want to be using a lot of morale taps, so having some points in here doesn't necessarily hurt. For set bonuses, you also get more morale tap damage. It's important to note, when you're in blue line you can use this gambit, whereas if you're in red line you can't. So there are some gambits like that, and this trait allows you access to shield mastery, which is a pretty nice buff that lasts a minute there. And here, shield tactics is another great one. It gives you CC immunity for that duration. It does have a slight kind of cooldown, but this skill and this trait, set bonus rather, is very important for some of the fights that you're gonna deal with, where you're gonna get stunned, and by getting stunned you're dead. So using that effectively, the Rune City fight, the last boss, when you get the eye, the pending eye, right, and you know you're about to get stunned, you can use that ability right before it and avoid that mechanic. So that's kind of crucial for doing like solo crazy things like soloing Rune City and stuff like that. And some of these other traits just help with general survivability. The main reason to use this build and go to the blue line over the red line is because of things like shield tactics. So although you lose some damage, it gives you some more survivability. The ability to also, because you're in blue line now, you get additional threat multipliers. So this is what I actually use for tanking as well as soloing. I think that pretty much summarizes the trait trees. Let me know if you guys have questions or specific comments. Stay tuned for other videos. I'm going to be posting some other content about, the gear that I'm using, virtues and LIs and rotations and stuff like that. So stay tuned for that. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you guys learned some stuff, and see you next time.